Whether you're doing a spot panel repair or painting your entire vehicle, getting perfect primer all starts with the preparation of the surface you're primering. The example we're working with today is body filler. We'll be priming over this body filler, blocking it, making sure it's perfectly ready for paint. Your bodywork and dent repair needs to be done before you primer. Primer is not designed to fill dents. Primer is also not designed to fill deep scratches, so your bodywork needs to be straight and properly prepped out before you primer. I only like to primer over a 320 grit scratch. If you primer over anything coarser than a 320 grit scratch, what's going to happen is as that vehicle ages, as that repair ages and is out in the sun, those materials are going to shrink. They're going to shrink into that scratch and it's going to show up underneath your paint job. I think we've all seen vehicles that have had repairs done and you can see some deep sanding scratches underneath the paint. It just makes for a very poor job. The higher the number on the sandpaper, the finer the scratch. So when we're blocking our body filler, we're blocking 80, we're moving to 180, to maybe 220, and then finally 320 before we're ready for a primer. So make sure your bodywork's straight. Any gouges or deep scratches in your body filler have been filled and your body filler has been sanded with 320 grit sandpaper. All those 80 and deeper scratches have been removed before you apply your primer. The type of primer I use over any body filler is always a 2K urethane primer. Now the primer we're using today is this upol 2253. This is a high build primer that can also be reduced and used as a primer surfacer, and also reduced a little bit more, it can be used as a sealer, and we'll use this as a sealer today. It's important to mix up your primer properly so you get the best performance out of it. We're using the Savito disposable cup system here. This is a Series 1 disposable cup system. Similar to a regular mixing cup, it has the ratios at the bottom. Now our primer mixes up 4:1:1 for a primer surfacer, which is what we want to use today. We don't need a high build primer because our bodywork has been prepared and is straight. We'll find our 4:1:1 mixing ratio at the bottom of the cup. We'll go to the 4 column. We'll add our primer, the amount of primer we want. We're going to go to the 1. And then we'll go to the next column and we'll add the amount of activator we need, which is the corresponding 1 in that column. And then we'll add the reducer in the last 1 column. I hope this is a clear enough explanation for you. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. So we'll add the amount of upol primer we want, and then we'll add our activator, which is 2323. If you're curious or interested in any of the products or tools I use, these Savito cups or this primer, check out my links down in the description. I'll try and add links to all the tools and products I use in this video. Here we'll just add the 1 part of reducer that we need. I'll use a stir stick to mix it up. We'll lock on this lid, and I always like to lift this up and make sure everything is sealed. Once it's sealed, I'll lock on the collar and we'll be ready to spray this primer. The gun I'm using today is the Eastwood LT100. We're going to set this gun up with our fluid volume 2.5 turns out from closed. We're going to have our fan pattern wide open, and I want to keep my overspray relatively low. So with this gun, I can set my air pressure at about 15 to 20 PSI and have minimal overspray. Now you don't need a special primer gun. You just want to make sure you have a large enough tip for the product you're spraying. If I was using a really high build primer, I would want something higher than a 1.4 tip. There's no real secret to applying primer. You just want to overlap about 80%. You want to have a consistent speed and a consistent distance from the panel and just lay it on as smooth as possible. Now we're going to put 1 coat on here. We're going to let this flash off for about 15 minutes. We want to let those chemicals evaporate before we apply our 2nd coat. Now I always like to apply 2 coats of primer just in case I need to block out any waves or imperfections. We're going to have enough material on that to block it out. If you're a DIYer working out of your garage, not in a paint booth with limited light, check out one of these gunnbud lights. They work really well, especially on lower parts of doors and stuff. Areas that don't get a ton of light, these come in really handy. So I'm going to apply the 2nd coat here. Now I always like to let my primer sit overnight. Make sure all those chemicals have evaporated, or a lot of those chemicals have evaporated, and it's nice and pure and ready to be sanded and blocked in the morning. Now it's time to block out our primer, and the sandpaper I'm using today is this 3M Cubitron Extract. This is awesome sandpaper. I've recently started using this, and it cuts amazing, and it lasts forever. I was using an expensive sandpaper, but I got tired of switching my sandpaper because it would just not last very long at all. And this stuff lasts forever and cuts great. So we're going to use this today. I'm using a small block. I'm going to show you how you can use a small block to get these panels straight. And what we're looking for when we block this is we want to remove that texture in the primer, and we want to see if there's any low areas in our repair. We also want to make sure there's no deep scratches, so we're inspecting this primer as we go along. Now I've taped off this body line. I want to make sure we took a lot of time getting that body line straight. I want to make sure we don't affect that body line in any way, so I've taped it off. We're going to block up to it. I've added a powdered guide coat here, and this guide coat is going to help us determine that our primer is flat and smooth, and we've removed all that texture. If we have any scratches, it's going to show up in that guide coat. If we have any low areas, it's going to show up in that guide coat. So this is going to help us get this panel perfectly straight. So I'm blocking this panel in sections. Obviously, we're doing the lower section first. I'm working my way from one end of the panel to the other, and we'll just do small sections and continue moving across the panel. We're blocking in an X pattern. You want to block in all different directions. And the guide coat's showing us whether we have any high or low areas, and so far we have no low areas, and that's because we got our bodywork straight before we primed. So we'll continue blocking this lower section. I'll pull the tape, we'll put a guide coat on the top section and block that out as well. I hope you're finding this video helpful. If you are, leave me a comment down below and consider subscribing to the channel. I'll finish blocking out this panel, and then we'll answer the big question, do you need sealer? In order to prep out the surface for the next step, we're going to machine sand it with some 600 grit sandpaper. Then I'm going to use this foam 600 grit pad to do all the edges and hard to reach areas. Before you move on to the next step, make sure your primer is sanded with 600 grit sandpaper. Remember, we want to keep decreasing that scratch before we paint or seal. Now, technically, you can paint and seal over 320 grit, but it can cause some issues if you're spraying a high metallic finish. So just to be on the safe side, prep everything out before you paint or seal with 600 grit sandpaper. The big question, do you need to use sealer? Now, I'll tell you how I feel about sealer, and the way I feel about it, being that I am spraying outside of a paint booth, in a garage, in an open garage, I tend to avoid sealer whenever possible. In an open garage, we know there's a lot more opportunity for dust or dirt to get into the substrate you're spraying. So if I'm spraying sealer and I get dust or dirt in my sealer, and then I don't sand that out before I paint and clear coat, then once I go to buff and polish that, I could sand through that into the sealer, and it could leave a gray spot in my finished job. Anytime I can avoid adding another product layer before I paint, I'm going to do so. Now, I'm not saying you should never use sealer. There are times when you absolutely should use sealer. The only time I use sealer is when I want to create a uniform colored surface for my base coat. Sealer is also great to use if you're concerned about the substrate you're painting. If you've got some older paint, maybe it's a lacquer paint, or maybe it's a paint that you don't know what kind of paint is on it, you can seal it before you paint it. That'll help keep your new base coat from reacting to that old paint and causing problems in your paint job. With that being said, I am going to apply sealer to this particular repair. So I went ahead and washed this repair area with some isopropyl alcohol to remove any contaminants before we mask it off and get it ready for paint. So this is the reason why I'm applying some sealer. I've got some areas where we've sanded through the primer, so we want one uniform color before we apply our base coat. I'll go ahead and mix up a small amount of sealer. We don't need a whole lot, and that's what's so great about this upol System 20. It can be used as a primer, primer surfacer, or a sealer. So we're going to mix this up 4 to 1 to 2. So 4 parts primer, 1 part activator, and 2 parts reducer. I'll be using this Viva R802 spray gun for the sealer. This is a new gun to me, and I have a review and demo on this gun. If you want to check it out, I'll leave a link at the end. This is kind of like a SATA replica, and it sprays really well, but we're going to adjust the fan pattern wide open. We're going to adjust the fluid volume to about 1.5 turns out. 2.5 turns out is wide open on this, so we're going to go about 1.5 turns out. And then the air pressure we're going to set at around 15 to 20 psi. I'll go ahead and tack down the vehicle before we apply our sealer. Then we'll apply sealer just like base coat. You want to be consistent with your distance and your speed. You want to overlap about 80%. Spray it just like base coat. I'm putting 2 coats on here. We're going to do 1 light coat, and then we'll wait 10 minutes and apply a second coat. There's a lot of things that go into painting your vehicle, and there's a lot of obstacles that you might need to overcome. Be sure to tune into next week's episode when I walk you through painting this pearl white finish with a budget gun. But if you want to learn more right now, check out one of these videos. I appreciate you watching. We'll see you next time on Garage Noise.